We're standing here on Main Street in early Houston. And in 1837, 1838, people would have gotten off the boat down at Allen's Landing and come up the bluff, and they would have been fed right on to Main Street. And certainly if there was ever a street that was aptly named, it was Main Street in Houston, because all the main activities of life in early Houston took place right here. You had Kessler's Round Tent, which was a notorious saloon. You had the Capitol Building. You had Sam Houston's Executive Mansion, which was little more than a shanty. We'll visit that later. But try to envision in your mind's eye, instead of a modern streetcar, wagons coming up a dirt street. Instead of a sidewalk, again, nothing but mud. Instead of modern brick buildings, shanties and tents, because that's all people could afford. Now, also imagine in this dirt mud street the carcasses of horses and oxen and cats, and occasionally people. Early reports from Houston said that when people came out on any given morning, you could find as many as 4 bodies lying dead in the streets, victims of the previous night's mayhem.
After the victory at San Jacinto and the capture of Mexican President Santana, all of the interim governments and consultations undertaken by the Texas revolutionaries suddenly became a sobering reality. The worst news was that they found their expected pathway suddenly closed.
When Texas first became a republic, one of the first things they did was to have people who could vote, and of course that was a fairly limited number, but people who could vote for whether they wanted annexation to the United States or not. And overwhelmingly, those people in Texas who could vote did choose. They wanted to be annexed to the United States.
That didn't happen, of course, and this was due almost entirely to the anti-slavery lobby in Congress. Now, the anti-slavery lobby was very, very small. It consisted of John Quincy Adams, who was a representative from Massachusetts, former president, and a few other members of the House of Representatives from New England.
The existence of slavery in Texas, the de facto existence of slavery in Texas, greatly complicated the question of the acquisition of Texas by the United States and its admission as a state, because so many people in the North didn't want another slave state added to the Union. Certainly as early as Andrew Jackson's successor, Martin Van Buren, the acquisition of Texas by the United States had become controversial, and had become controversial on slave grounds.
They were able to block annexation simply by drawing attention to the slavery issue. Annexation of Texas would mean, of course, the admission of a vast new empire, slave empire, into the Union. The slavery issue was a toxic one in Washington. It was the issue that nobody talked about. And the reason nobody talked about it was because it was very difficult to be a national candidate unless you could appeal to North and South. So slavery had, for all intents and purposes, as a political issue, been swept under the rug. And it was raised, and it was raised in a very, very vocal manner by people like John Quincy Adams and a handful of others.
Martin Van Buren continued trying to get Texas, as his predecessors had done, but he felt it necessary to conduct the negotiations secretly. The secret negotiations were then exposed by former President John Quincy Adams, who was now serving in the House of Representatives and who was now a political opponent of Jackson and Van Buren, and so he didn't mind in the least embarrassing the Van Buren administration in this way. As soon as Adams revealed what was going on, President Van Buren felt it necessary to terminate the negotiations.
So the issue was deemed so explosive that the Van Buren administration, which had initially expected to annex Texas, decided that it was not going to enter into further negotiations with Texas diplomats. So by 1839, the annexation issue was dead in the water.
With annexation off the table, Texans reluctantly set about building a new nation, and they had a myriad of tasks ahead of them.
Whoa, all of a sudden we've got to be a country. Well, how do you be a country? The papers from Houston's first term just show the scramble of everything from ordering account books from New Orleans to wafers of sealing wax so that we would have something to stamp the Great Seal of the Republic in. We didn't have any currency, and there was very little U.S. money in Texas at that time. People bartered, really. When the steamboat came up the river with clothes and furniture, you had your corn and your cowhides on the riverbank.
As happens when any revolution must turn to the real business of running a country, there were a cacophony of viewpoints.
All new states are invested, more or less, by a class of noisy, second-rate men who are always in favor of rash and extreme measures. But Texas is absolutely overrun by such men. General Sam Houston.
Texas also needed a seat of government. Perhaps appropriately, they chose for the capital a town that did not yet even exist. It was to be called Houston, and it came courtesy of a family from upstate New York.
Charlotte Baldwin's father was a doctor and had actually founded the town of Baldwinsville, New York. It had been a very successful venture for him. The family had, acquired some wealth from it. And I feel like that was very much the pattern, the model that the Allens had when they decided to come to Texas.
They left New York in 1833 and arrived in 34. They took the Overland Passage, which took them through Natchitoches and into Nacogdoches and San Augustine, and that's where they set up shop first.
Texas smelled like opportunity for the entrepreneurial brothers.
It was a place, I think, of kind of new beginnings and land. It was very easy to get land, but they were buying land, trading land, and felt like that would be a lucrative venture down in this part of the world. I've always assumed the Allens were perhaps not doing all that well in New York with their ventures and what they were doing.
John Kirby became a member of the Nacogdoches Committee of Vigilance, and AC very much was involved in land deals.
Historical records paint older brother AC as studious.
I've always viewed Augustus probably as a very serious, maybe even a little stern. He was, a mathematician, and I think the business plan, the numbers, the figures were very important to him.
AC was very much the engineer, the professor type. He had taught at Yates College and was a professor of calculus.
John Kirby Allen was quite a different man.
And John Kirby, I think, was just entirely the reverse. He apparently had a very outgoing personality, was very much a salesman. That's apparent when he was able to get the votes for the town becoming the capital. And so I think they complemented each other.
John Kirby, a younger brother by 2 years, was very much the forward, bon vivant type fellow that was a politician by nature and friendly with everyone.
The brothers came looking for a town site. Their first choice was the location of the community of Harrisburg at the confluence of Buffalo and Brays Bayous, the natural head of navigation. But that property was hopelessly snarled in probate litigation, so they opted for a second choice, a location that is now at the heart of a teeming city of millions.
Why did they pick this spot? They came upstream in a little boat and did depth soundings because they were trying to make sure they could get the ocean-going vessels upstream. They needed 10 feet of depth at that time. And so this area had at least 10 feet. So that was one of the criteria they were looking for.
And Buffalo at the time was a clear, clean stream. You could see the blue clay bottom, and many of the early travelers described how beautiful it was. Buffalo divided the East Texas piney woods. About half of it was piney woods on one side, and the other half entered the prairie. So we have this marvelous opportunity here.
The other criteria they were looking for was that they needed water all year round. They were aware that the Austin colony was established on the Brazos River, and Stephen F. Austin had figured that they could use the Brazos River to take the boats up to San Felipe. And as we know, the Brazos dries out in the season and dry season, and so it's not navigable all year round. The Allen brothers knew that this bayou had water in it all year round because it had a tidal flow, and what they were attempting to find was the highest level they could upstream of tidal flow. And there was tidal flow at this point.
There were, however, benefits to being slightly farther inland. The bulk of Stephen Austin's colonists lived farther west.
So it was an economic decision that they needed to come as far up Buffalo Bayou as they could to access the Brazos River agriculture, the cotton that they could sell and the sugar cane, and the molasses that was made from that.
And the third thing they were looking for was the fact that if they were bringing 50 and 60-foot vessels up from New Orleans or other places in the world, that they had to be able to turn them around. And so they needed a place to turn the boats around, and they found here a White Oak Bayou that entered at this point and created a natural turning basin.
And it really was deep enough to get a vessel through there, and that was a steamboat that would draw no more than 6 feet of water, which is what the older vessels drew also. So this was the place that you would want to stop. You would not go much further than your vessel would let you go.
It was John Kirby's political gift that got Houston chosen as the temporary capital of Texas.
The congressman from Nacogdoches who was pushing Houston to be the capital when Nacogdoches also would have liked to have been the capital. But I think this was his personality, and also he saw how it worked. And they'd gotten down to one of the last votes, and he just was able to convince 2 congressmen to change their vote by telling them he would give them lots in the town, and they were wonderful lots. They would have bordered what was to have been the House of Congress.
And it was from that position that he was able to leverage the deals necessary to ensure that Houston was the first capital of the new Republic of Texas.
Sam Houston also pushed for the capital to be located in the new town.
Right man, politically savvy. He always, particularly after his victory at San Jacinto, he wanted the capital city to be named after him.
But I think there's more to it, too. The Allen brothers had, to sort of sweeten the deal, had given him plots inside Houston. to do with, as he would to sell or whatever. Sam, here, these are yours. You know, this is our gift to you.
I've always been amazed that it was chosen because it was still a town on paper. There was nothing here.
A.C. Allen's wife, Charlotte, did not have a pleasant first trip to Texas.
Charlotte came down in 1835. She had a miscarriage shortly thereafter and went back to New York until 1837, after the founding of the city of Houston in 1836.
They only had one child to survive. Charlotte had several miscarriages, lost one child.
One legend surrounding Charlotte Allen fails the test of historians.
There's the story that Charlotte came up with the idea of naming the town for Sam Houston over dinner one night. She just very, gallantly said to General Houston, "We'll name our town for you." I think the name was chosen very shrewdly, and I doubt that it was a dinner time solution.
According to Dr. O.F. Allen, who was a nephew and lived in the Charlotte Baldwin Allen home, it wasn't the truth. She did not name the city.
Most people believe the trouble that led to a split between Charlotte and Augustus Allen started with the death of John Kirby Allen from disease in 1838.
The estate was not settled quickly and not settled well, and the legend has it that Charlotte was very unhappy. This also makes me wonder if some of her money really was used and she felt like that it was not being handled properly, and that really may have been one thing that began an estrangement between them, but they never would talk about it. So I don't think we really know exactly what evolved there.
It has been said that he had agreed to disagree on matters pertaining to properties owned by them. He, A.C., justly conceded what there was to her and went his way.
At one point, he just decided to leave, and he did sign over what remaining property, I guess, was in his name to do that, to her.
A.C. had no qualms in turning things over to her when he left for Mexico because he knew that she would take care of things. In fact, she had already set up her own divisions on the north side of the Buffalo Bayou that were hers, and she traded back and forth land deals and so forth. Had her own cattle brand.
It was Charlotte who would remain in Houston as a prominent citizen until her death in 1895.
Immediately over my shoulder is doubly significant because not only is it the site of the old Rice Hotel, Houston's most opulent hotel for decades, but before that it was the site of the Texas Capitol building during the time that Houston served as capital of the Republic of Texas. Indeed, that's one of the ways that the Allen brothers convinced the Houston Congress to move the capital from Columbia to Houston, because they said, look, if you'll move the capital to Houston, we'll build the Capitol building for you at our expense. And they were as good as their word. The lumber for that building was imported from Maine. So imagine every board in the Capitol being shipped from Maine, hauled up Buffalo Bayou, hauled up from Allen's Landing to this location. It stood there as the Capitol from 1837 to 1839 when the Capitol moved to Austin. However, the Allen brothers very shrewdly kept the title to the building, and after the Capitol left, it became a flourishing hotel for a number of years thereafter.
The most famous citizen of the new capital city was the hero of San Jacinto, and in many ways, he reflected the fledgling town.
Of course, he moved here when Houston became the temporary capital of the Republic. He was not married, so he was a single man, known for a lot of his partying, and we can only assume, that maybe he did a good bit of that here.
Texas was called the Bachelor Republic. There was more men than there were women, and they outnumbered the women quite a bit.
And of course, all the ladies wanted to dance with Sam Houston, especially the daughters. Their daughters to dance with General Sam because he was a single bachelor and, you know, fairly well-to-do.
The newly elected president faced a tough job as chief executive.
He held the republic together. I think a lot of people thought that Texas might be annexed pretty soon after the revolution, or within at least before Andrew Jackson left office. Even though I'm sure Houston, looked forward to that and wanted that, he obviously did. But he saw that was not going to happen right away, and so he had to get the republic on good, solid footing.
The first president of Texas was enormously popular at first.
He's the hero of San Jacinto. He wins in a landslide election. And so at the beginning of his term, there's all this hope and optimism and excitement about the republic's future. But things don't work out. In 2 years, these are very short presidential terms, things go very badly for the republic. His first and foremost goal is to stabilize things in Texas. And so he sets a series of policies that are meant to stabilize Texas financially more than anything else. And so he initiates a policy, for example, of establishing peace with all the Indian tribes in Texas. And the main reason for that is it's so much cheaper to have a peace treaty than to have war, and therefore to have an army that deals with the Comanches or any of the other groups that are in Texas at the time. It was unpopular with most Anglo-Texans, but Houston recognized that financially it was the only way to go.
Though the people at large continued supporting him, a fair number of his fellow politicians attacked. Whether their motives were rooted in policy or jealousy is open to interpretation.
Sam Houston was a complex and controversial figure. He was an individual of very irreconcilable personal characteristics. On the one hand, he could be a wise and sagacious leader. On the other hand, he could often be found having had too much to drink and far from being in a sober state. Houston was mercurial. Houston was sharp-spoken. Houston had a tongue that was almost as sharp a weapon as his revolver and his sword. Houston was the kind of person that spoke his mind, but he was also a person of deep and profound political thought. Houston attracted people from strong viewpoints of either support or revulsion. Most people in the Republic of Texas vehemently loved Sam Houston or vehemently hated him. Sam Houston was not a middle ground sort of political leader.
As to what Sam Houston thought about Sam Houston,
I humble myself before God, and there the list ends. President Sam Houston.
the city of Houston that bore Sam's name was designed from the outset to be a temporary capital.
A lot of people who are living in Houston at this time, during the time that it was capital of the Republic, had money. They had a lot of money. They could have built really nice houses in Houston, but the reason people aren't investing in better housing in Houston is they anticipate another Mexican invasion. And the memories of the runaway scrape in 1836 are still fresh in their mind. And their thinking is, why invest in a fancy home when we might have to evacuate Houston and burn everything down? It's very much a temporary city. It is the temporary capital. It's supposed to be the capital until 1840. It didn't quite make it. It left in 39 when Lamar was elected. But there was never a sense of permanence. There was a real sense of here today, gone tomorrow.
Houston was a very rustic town, and the president's dwelling was a far cry from Washington's White House.
Houston was rustic. It was basically an outline of city lots with surveyor stakes. It was developing as the Congress met, as the Republican government was there. They did have a Capitol building, and it was finished after the time that the Capitol moved there. But no, most of them were clapboard cabins. They didn't necessarily log cabins because they did have some sawmills in the area that they could use rough lumber from, but they weren't fancy mansions or fancy stores.
Accommodations in the rapidly growing but tenuous city were hard to come by, and newcomers usually took what they could find.
The first week, I shared Robert's sleeping space on the planks of his office, until the Gerlachs provided sleeping accommodations for me in the attic of their boarding house by the side of 13 companions. Pigs regularly held a party under the office during the night, so that we had to go to sleep to the melodious grunting of these unbearable animals. Gustav Dressel.
Those who attempted to fill the Houston void with a little capital and enterprise found the road rather rough. The poor Texas economy almost ensured it. Englishwoman Matilda Houston wrote of her hotel's owner.
He had a great many bad debts. It was, he told us, a losing concern altogether. More went out than came in, and only that morning, having asked a gentleman to pay his bill, the reply was, "If you come to insult me again, sir, by God, I will shoot you."
The fare offered at local boarding house tables did not impress the more persnickety visitors like Mrs. Houston.
We went down to breakfast in the public room. The food consisted of tough beef steaks, each as large as a good-sized dish, eggs hardly warmed through, and emptied over the meat and squirrel. Mrs. E. M. Houston.
Even President Sam Houston himself was living in a less than glamorous abode.
Houston lived in a little small cabin or a little small home right there next to where the legislature met, and it was pretty rough and pretty crude. And of course, it was nice to live in a city that was named after you.
John J. Audubon came to Houston in 1837 and wrote his account of what going to visit the president was like. And it is grim sounding. He talks about the muddy floors and the boards that didn't meet, and you know, it just sounds like it was really kind of a shack with a shed built onto it.
And it appeared that when they finished the whiskey bottles, they just throw them in the other room, or their food containers, or whatever, chicken bones, you know. There wasn't a trash pickup, so just put them in the entry room, the mud room. And so that floor was just littered and probably stank. Houston tried to hold all that together from this small room in the executive mansion that he shared with Ashbel Smith, his good friend and personal physician.
In 1838, I believe, they did build a president's home at the corner of Main and Prairie. And what actually they bought Francis Lubbock's storehouse to have as the White House of the Republic. Today the Scanlon building is on that corner. It has a plaque saying that it was the site of the White House. But of course, Sam Houston did not remain president, and Mirabeau B. Lamar was really the one who lived in that until they moved the capital to Waterloo, which they renamed Austin.
With the population in the hundreds, anyone was likely to pass the hero of San Jacinto on the street.
Houston knew everybody, and everybody knew Houston. And again, remember, this is Jacksonian America, where, you know, the notion of the common man, I mean, anybody could get an audience with the president. And you saw him everywhere. I think it's Gustav Dressel, the German immigrant, who says there are no stoves. And in the winter, it's not only cold, but it's wet. So you've got all of these guys huddling around a central fire in front of Kessler's Roundhouse. And there's Houston among them, trying to keep warm with everybody else.
At that time, 1,500 to 2,000 people, mostly men, were living together in Houston in the most dissimilar manner. The president, the whole personnel of the government, many lawyers who found ample means of support in the new regions, a large number of gamblers, tradesmen, artisans, former soldiers, adventurers, curious travelers from the United States, about 100 Mexican prisoners who made suitable servants, daily new troops of Indians, all associated like charms on an equal footing.
He was a citizen of the community. It's nothing like we have today, you know. He was just in the mix with everybody else, and he was a lawyer, and he interacted with the legal community there, and he was approachable and accessible and all those things.
Of course, this was such a small place at the time. You would expect to pass him on the street and see him eating somewhere. You know, it would not have been an unusual experience at all.
The rugged town offered many temptations.
Houston was full of drinking places, saloons. Had many more of those than they had of any other kind of business.
Houston had more saloons than churches, you know, when it first started, and some might contend it still does.
Per his reputation, Sam Houston often partook in the city's raucous diversions.
I think he drank. I think he drank too much. And I think he admitted he drank too much. I think he wasn't the only one. There was lots of drinking going on.
Some of that is exaggerated, but there's no doubt that he did drink too much on occasion, because he even records it in his letters and in his reminiscences.
That was a part of the time, you know. I think we have to, you know, as we often must do, is go back and think about his life and the lives of those people in their time. Just don't try to bring them into our time.
In Texas barrooms, one cannot in decency order a drink without inviting all of one's acquaintances and their friends who happen to be present. This is, of course, reciprocated, and thus there are frequent occasions for drinking. Gustav Dressel.
Whiskey was far more drinkable than contaminated water. And people drank it so they would feel better. If you can imagine a life without aspirin, without antihistamines, without any kind of pain relief, except for some over-the-counter stuff that who knows what was in it. Some are not very flattering of Houston, saying Sam was always kind of, had a little too much to imbibe. He didn't know what was going on half the time. But it's funny how, if that was true, how did he write all these letters and bills and messages to the Congress? A lot of the excess reports are by his enemies or political enemies, especially old Mirabeau and Lamar, who could not stand Sam Houston, and vice versa. Houston could not stand Lamar. In fact, they got into a big court battle in Harris County.
Journals of the day include a few specific accounts of the president's behavior.
Even when they went to the opera one time, and there's Mrs. Barker remembered that General Houston and his entourage were a bit inebriated, but he eloquently managed to stifle a big fight that was going to go on because the manager wanted to unseat the gamblers from the front row at the opera. So you can imagine what kind of highbrow comedy opera this was. And I don't think they were doing Shakespeare, but they might have been, you know.
President Sam Houston was known to be more flesh and blood than the carefully crafted images of today's politicians.
And you know, Sam Houston had periods of depression and down times, and you know, he struggled with some demons, and which I think ultimately makes him much more impressive today, because he got through those. He overcame those things and was able to pull himself out of the depths and out of those down periods, and look what he accomplished.
The new town that shared Sam's name worked to overcome demons of its own.
Once goods were offloaded here at Allen's Landing, be it flour or coffee or furniture or clothing, it then had to be hauled up this rather steep bluff. Now, standing here now, it's very manicured. It looks like a park, which is what it is today. But in 1837 and 1838, this would have been dirt. And when it rained, which it rains frequently here in Houston, it would have been mud. So today we have the idiomatic expression, we're going down a slippery slope. But it's equally hard to go up a slippery slope, and that's the problem facing early Houstonians who had to get all of these goods from Allen's Landing up this slope in the mud. What you would have seen on the day are mules and wagons hauling with men pushing, trying to get up this slope. But once you got to the top of the rise here, there was Main Street, and that was when most people would have gotten their first view of Houston City.
What newcomers saw when they crested the rise from the bayou was a bustle of activity.
There was lively and varied activity going on in Houston at that time. Steamboats from Galveston tied up daily. The owners of land certificates and tradesmen of all sorts arrived on horseback from the interior of the country. Among them, many a Mexican smuggler. They brought with them news from the frontier, pointed out the beauty of newly discovered regions, and described their adventures with the Indians and the wild beasts. Gustav Dressel.
The workers at the Port of Houston were overwhelmingly enslaved Africans.
I think a lot of people would be surprised about the institution of urban slavery. A lot of people inside the city owned slaves that they frequently hired out to other people.
People who owned slaves did it as an investment, and they expected to get income from this. They may keep one or two on the premises as domestics, but very often the rest are what's called hired out. Some are hired out to neighboring plantations. So ride out in the morning, go out to Alameda, and then come back.
Slaves would have been especially evident down at Allen's Landing. Anything that goes in or out of Houston goes in or out by way of Allen's Landing. And someone has to unload all that stuff, and you would have slaves unloading the boats.
In some instances, the slave-holder negotiates the contract and gets the pay. In other instances, they send their slaves out and say, okay, I want $5 a week. And they can negotiate their own wages, their own housing, and they pay a certain income to the slave owner. So what you have is a breakdown of the general economic work regimen and everything else, and all the other freedoms come with it.
Houston was connected to the rest of Texas by the most primitive of roadways, sometimes. Other routes were very much do-it-yourself.
In a country where roads do not exist, it is difficult not to lose one's way. The danger is considerably increased when the trail of previous travelers is obliterated by the rains. For plumbing the track, the Texan term for tracing a road, is at all times a slow and tedious operation. Between Houston and Washington, there was a space of 2 miles that was not traversed in less than 4 hours. So deep was the mire. Matilda Houston.
Many travelers rode these distances alone on horseback, and many conditions could present serious, even deadly hazards. Even rough weather needed to be accounted for.
As the storm began, dark night surrounded me, and it was bitterly cold. I was wet through and through in no time. My head on my saddle, my body on the ground in the water. My dog ran away 3 times into the thicket to find shelter. But he always returned as soon as the wolves began to howl. To bear such privations by oneself is very hard. If one has a companion, one complains on every occasion, and on learning that the other is not any better off, he is comforted thereby.
Another travel option was aboard the stagecoach lines that sprang up. Their primary money-making purpose was to carry the mail, but they also hauled passengers with at least a modicum of comfort.
It was an expensive way to travel also. If the roads are dry, 5 cents a mile. If they're muddy, price doubles, 10 cents a mile.
The trip, as well as the fees, the cost to travel, were entirely dependent on the weather and the conditions. The worse the weather, the more it had been raining, the harder it was to get up and down the roads, the more they'd charge. During the best weather, maybe average 5 or 6 miles an hour was doing pretty good. So you're looking at, 60, 70 miles a day max.
Along the San Felipe Road, today's West Dallas, were the city's first burial grounds.
The Founders Cemetery was the first cemetery that the city had, and it was on the outskirts, about a mile out, and that's where the first burials took place.
Well, when Houston was platted in 1836, obviously they needed a burial ground. So it was the first cemetery that was developed on the old San Felipe Road, west of Houston, which is now Dallas Street.
This cemetery holds people who experienced Texas history from the very beginning of the drive for independence. Well, around 1836 and 37, they started burying people here, and originally the founders of the city of Houston, John Kirby Allen, was buried here, as well as the first Commodore of the Texian Navy, Commodore Thompson. There were people who survived the runaway scrape. There were signers of the Texas Declaration of Independence. And the third president of the Republic of Texas's mother is buried here. Mirabeau Lamar's mother, Rebecca, is buried here.
And it reached its capacity very soon because Houston, with its close in proximity to 2 bayou systems, there was a lot of malaria, so there was a lot of deaths. They call it the yellow death, yellow fever. Many people died, so there was a lot of burials there.
Though called City Cemetery, there was private ownership.
And at some point, the Methodist Church took over stewardship of the cemetery, and it was called Old Methodist Cemetery for many years.
Graveyards or no, Houston was a lively town.
Standing here in this vacant lot is the site of Henry Kessler's Round Tent Saloon. Like so many early Houston businesses, Henry Kessler did his business out of a tent. And what a tent it was. It was said to have had a circumference of over 100 feet. And it is also said to have stood 40 feet high. So imagine a white tent, like a circus tent. And then that was the most notorious saloon in Houston. And when we think of early frontier saloons, we think of people serving rot gut whiskey and bust head gin, and certainly they served their share of that. But we also know from reading the records at the time that they mixed fancy cocktails, and a special favorite was mint juleps and eggnog. Eggnog in the early days of the Republic was not just a drink for Christmas, it was an everyday drink. And it was especially expensive considering that eggs in early Houston went for about 50 cents a piece. But Henry Kessler himself is a rather interesting character. He was a native of Silesia, and he came to Texas to fight in the Texas Revolution, and after the war came into Houston, opened a tent, and got rich almost overnight. He was notorious for trading drinks for bounty certificates of the soldiers who wanted a drink more than they wanted their land. But he did not long live to enjoy his ill-gotten gains, because he died here in Houston of a yellow fever in 1840.
Sam Houston had plenty of company when he bellied up to the bar. The story of many of these drinkers was the story of the Texas Army, now headed by Mississippian Felix Houston.
And they arrive in Texas in the summer of 1836, which is, of course, after San Jacinto. Appropriately enough, they arrive in Texas on July 4th. But to their dismay, they discover that Santa Anna is captured. The Mexican army is in full retreat, and for the moment anyway, there's nobody to fight. There's no glory to be had. So these people become very bored very easily. At that time, the army, the Republic of Texas Army, is actually more a danger to the people of Texas than the Mexican army, because they're going around appropriating, right, foodstuffs, cattle, and they're more like a band of robbers than anything else. President Sam Houston solves one problem only to create another. He furloughs the army. Now these are young men without family, without jobs, with a lot of wild oats to sow. They're bored, they're thirsty, and the fledgling town of Houston seems like their kind of place. But a lot of these furloughed soldiers become part of a criminal underclass, what the respectable people in Houston call, and this is not my term, this is what they call them the rowdy loafers.
These soldiers came bearing little in the way of hard cash.
You had all of these soldiers and sailors, and they received what they call a certificate of military entitlement. And this was for their service. It was $8 a month for a private, and the pay scale went up from there. You know, there were no banks in Texas. They couldn't cash this. And all these soldiers kept trying to sell this stuff, and they'd buy the stuff at 10 and 15 cents on the dollar. They'd buy headright certificates for 640 acres of land for $3 or something like this. Just ridiculous amounts, anything to get hard currency. If you look at those early pay certificates, you'll find that almost all of that many of those, in many instances, they say pay to bearer on the back. Pay to the bearer, pay to the bearer, pay to the bearer. So all that stuff, they were just passing the buck from one person to another. And it was like the last person that got stuck with it. You didn't want to be him.
The ever-present weapon among the ex-soldiers was the Bowie knife.
In early Texas, the Bowie knife was considered the quintessential Texas weapon. And it is a weapon throughout the 19th century that is closely linked with both the Republic of Texas and the state of Texas. It's hard to think of Texans without their Bowie knives. In fact, it is said that when foreigners would come into Galveston and get off the boats, there were vendors set up selling Bowie knives. Bowie knives were the Saturday night specials of their day. And again, you've got these rowdy loafers and their Bowie knives. They're young men, they drink heavily, and they've got these knives, these gargantuan knives. Well, let's look at one. Here is a Bowie knife. A couple of design features. Of course, this edge here is sharp, razor sharp, which you would expect of any knife, a common butcher knife. But the advantage you have with a Bowie knife, and the distinctive part of a Bowie knife, is you've got also this clipped point here. Now the advantage to that clipped point is that if we're in a knife fight and you thrust at me, I can parry with my knife, go into your stomach and rip out using this clipped point. But it's clear that these people thought deeply, because if you notice, there is a brass strip set into the back of the blade, and the quillins, which is a fancy knife term for cross guards, is also brass. Now the reason it's brass is because brass is softer than steel. And again, what I hope will happen is that in a fight, you will thrust, I will parry, and the edge of your knife will sink into the soft brass of my knife, lodged there, and I can disarm you. It's not a tool. It's not very good to skin a deer with. It's not very good to whittle with. It's good for one thing. It's good to kill people with.
So how many of the violent confrontations ended in death?
It's hard to say what the murder rate was in early Houston. We know from the various journals that bodies are found on the street almost every morning. But we also know, because Francis Moore just says this, that he tends not to report in the Telegraph and Texas Register news that will present Houston in a negative light. So we only know about these murders through the journals, and we know there were a lot of them. But mainly what they are is rowdy loafers killing other rowdy loafers. And there are some people in the community who view that as what we might call a casual killing. If a rowdy loafer offs another rowdy loafer, good riddance. Is there some way we can arrange it where they'll all, kill each other? When it becomes a problem, though, in the case of David James Jones, is when he kills a gentleman. And they tend to take a very dim view of rowdy loafers killing someone who is a gentleman of style and substance.
Though they might not have been as plentiful, there were decent establishments in Houston, too.
We're standing at the corner of Franklin and Travis Streets in downtown Houston, and the reason this location is so important is because right here in 1837 and 1838 was the site of Floyd's American Hotel. And this was where John Hunter Herndon stayed in his early days here in Houston. And by Houston standards, it was considered quite a luxuriant hotel. Now, reason that John Hunter Herndon is so important, and he really was one of the most fascinating people to ever live in early Houston. He was a lawyer by profession. He was a very well-educated man. He graduated from Transylvania University, which incidentally is the same place that Stephen F. Austin graduated from up in Kentucky. But the main reason that John Hunter Herndon is so important to our story is because of the diary he kept. He kept a very meticulously detailed diary. He was sort of the Samuel Pepys of early Houston, and his diary really is a window into the early days and life of this town.
Those journals are the source of most everything we know about life in early Houston, and it was not a pretty picture.
It would be almost impossible to overestimate the squalor that existed in early Houston. You had one inhabitant describe it as the most miserable place in the world.
Because of its physical geographic location, every vermin you could think of was here. There's stories of alligators coming up from the bayou, walking down Main Street, such as it was.
On one side, it was described as having very, very bare homes or bare stores, and on the other side it had tents, and in the middle it had mud.
But everybody who comes to Houston talks about the mud. But it's not just the mud. You also have people throwing refuse out into the street. So you've got garbage, you've got offal. And also the mud, we were talking about the mud a while ago, is so deep and is such a viscous stew that horses and cattle sink down in it and you can't get them out. And they die. So you've got animal carcasses, you've got dead cats, you've got dead horses, and imagine the stench of that. And that, of course, attracts the rats that one inhabitant says the Houston rats are the size of prairie dogs. These rowdy loafers would get all liquored up and pass out, and they would wake up the next morning and their noses or their toes would be chewed off by rats. And you think, oh, come on. If a rat is chewing on your nose or your finger, you're not going to feel that and wake up? Well, actually, no. Because there is an anesthetic ingredient in the saliva of rats that deadens the tissue.
As regards to rats, they were a great pest at that time. Thousands of these troublesome guests made sport by night, and nothing could be brought to safety from them. All the provisions were soon been gnawed by them, and the best rat dog became tired of destroying them because their number never decreased. Rats often dashed across me by the half-dozens at night. In the beginning, this proves annoying, of course. Later, one gets accustomed to it. Gustav Dressel.
The town's promoters exaggerated the finer points of Houston.
The Allen brothers are credited with becoming Houston's largest main boosters and promoters. True, no doubt about it. As far as advertising Houston as, this beautiful city, rolling hills and green meadows, and it's like, this isn't Houston, right? But that's how they sold it to people from the East to come to Texas. And then once you get here, where are you going to go? Because a lot of people spent their final dollars getting here. They're stuck here. Now it's home with the mosquitoes, with the swamps, with the bio, with the malaria, with the yellow fever epidemics. I mean, it was a pretty raw place.
Even the better establishments might deal in vice.
We're standing on the corner of Congress and Milam, and this building right behind me where it says Law Office for Rent. And it's rather ironic because on the site of this building stood early Houston's most notorious bordello, Pamela Mann's mansion house. And I won't make any analogies between lawyers and prostitutes because, well, that would be beneath me. But where this building is now and where the mansion house stood was a site of almost constant activity, young men coming and going. And from its earliest days, prostitution was a problem. And the early city council passed an ordinance which made it against the law for prostitutes to be out on the streets after 8 o'clock at night. So what they did is they moved their business activities into boarding houses. And Pamela Mann's was one of the most notorious. Pamela Mann, by the way, was a personal friend of President Sam Houston, and he was best man at her son's wedding.
Whatever the town's leading citizens were doing at night, by day, they did try to improve the quality of life. The home of Charlotte and Augustus Allen was one social center of Houston.
It was the center of attention. It was the focal point for soirees and dinners. In fact, when Charlotte came to Houston in 1837, the first thing she did was to have a huge soiree in honor of Sam Houston.
Important people would come in and stay with them at no expense to the person. And so there are accounts that say, they may have spent $3,000, close to $4,000 a year doing this, you know, entertaining them and housing them in a way to curry favor with them.
And if somebody showed up on her doorstep without any money, no big deal. It wasn't a boarding house, it was her home, and she greeted everybody with open arms.
Their home, I think, was used a great deal to attract people who might bring some support to the town, ideas, maybe even money. And so I think she had a very important role.
Often, improvements came via organized groups like the Masonic Lodge.
The Masonic Order was incredibly important in early Houston and in early Texas. Anson Jones was probably instrumental in getting the Masonic movement up and going. Sam Houston was a Mason. Lamar was a Mason. Well, you have to ask, probably a better question was, who wasn't a Mason? Because if you were a mover and a shaper, you were a Mason. I think you could say, especially in Houston, that the Masonic Order was seen as an institution of public uplift. Suffice it to say that most of the rowdy loafers were not Masons. And I could see that the Masons would, along with the Texas Philosophical Society and institutions like this, were, you know, people were trying to make Houston a better place.
The Texas Philosophical Society was formed for intellectual growth.
The more brainier bunch, and at that time it didn't take much, could all meet in one room. And it lists like a who's who of Houston and Texas history at the time. And they gathered here in 1837, first weekend in December, and had this very long and lofty statement of their, you know, philosophical, of economic, cultural, military, and on and on and on. It's a flowery thing. But it was signed by people like Sam Houston and Mirabeau Lamar, who incidentally couldn't stand each other. A group met and discussed things. This was, of course, much of else to do at a night in Houston, Texas. You know, there just wasn't a whole lot going on back then except knife fights and saloons and things like that. And they wanted a little more intellectual stimulation. Well, there is no written record of their meetings or knife fights or fist fights.
Eventually, the city would even attract churches.
Houston was very slow to display religion. This town was over 2 years old before we had any kind of organized congregation here. And of course, Houston had the reputation of being a little bit wild and woolly in its early days.
William Ewell Allen sailed up from Galveston to start bringing the word, so to speak, to Houston. He came on an Easter Sunday in 1838, and that day he preached 3 times in the Senate building. A year later, he asked those who would be interested in starting a Presbyterian church to stay after the services, and they did. 11 people stayed.
Churches formed with very few members. I mean, some of these congregations had maybe 15 members or 20 members and actually did not grow to be quite large. The Presbyterians were the first one to build a structure, and they even let other churches use it. A lot of services in the beginning were held at the Capitol building because these congregations did not have a meeting place, and so they could go to the Capitol and use the chambers there.
This is where all of the community goings-on that were large were held, including the preaching of the gospel, and that's where the Presbyterians met.
Though welcomed by city leaders, the new churchmen stuck together.
A little lot was given to him by the founder, A.C. Allen, and on that he built a little one-room shack, and he slept on a bale of hay. And then sometime just shortly after he came, an Episcopal missionary, so to speak, came, And so very often he would share his he would share his house with the Episcopal minister, and they were very good friends.
The Presbyterians had the first church structure in town.
There was no church building here while Houston was the capital, but there were church people here.
Churches had a foothold, but Houston was still a town steeped in iniquity.
Standing in front of the historic Gulf Building over my right shoulder, and this entire area here at Main and Capitol was the site of the dueling grounds of early Houston. During the period that Houston served as capital for the Republic of Texas, many notorious and at least one comical duel was fought here. The comical duel involved a prominent Houston citizen, Thomas Pegleg Ward. Now, he was a building contractor. In fact, he was the fellow who actually built the Capitol. And even before the Capitol was finished, it became a gathering place for the rowdy loafers who would meet there at night and involve themselves in all sorts of shenanigans. And Ward believed that they might actually burn the place down. And of course, he was responsible for it until such a time as the Allen brothers or the government took possession. And so he went over there one night and chased them all out. But one of these fellows took umbrage and slapped him. Well, he went for his pistol, and a friend of his kept him from doing mischief then. But the next day, he sent a challenge to the fellow who had slapped him, and they met here on the dueling grounds for their personal contest. And the entire city of Houston turned out to see the duel. Well, when the shots were exchanged, Ward missed, but his adversary landed right on target, or a tad lower, because his bullet landed in Pegleg's peg leg. It hit wood, and there was a resounding thwack of lead going into wood, and the crowd, you could hear a titter that climbed the range up to a crescendo of guffaws. People just thought this was the funniest thing they had ever seen, seeing old Pegleg Ward getting shot in his wooden leg. And it seemed to have won over Pegleg because he saw how ridiculous this was, and the two combatants shook hands and thereafter were friends.
Not all dueling ended so happily, and the contests were frequent.
There was a lot of dueling in Houston among the upper crust of Houston society, or at least among those who considered themselves the upper crust of Houston society.
The man to stop this practice was Francis Moore Jr.
Well, Dr. Francis Moore Jr. was one of the most interesting and at the same time one of the most contentious people in Texas history.
He was a doctor, medical doctor, but he also studied law, and he was known here most for the newspaper, Telegraph and Texas Register, once it moved to Houston from Columbia.
I believe inherited with his mother's milk some of the same values of Cotton Mather. He was sort of a blue nose, he was very sanctimonious, but he was also, like those people, New Englander, heavily New England stock, had a real work ethic.
As a child, Moore lost an arm in an accident, but it didn't seem to slow his work ethic. He came to Texas and bought an interest in the Telegraph and Texas Register, first in Columbia and later in the new town of Houston, where he became owner and editor.
He was the editor of the paper, and he, as I said, he did not hesitate to, make his feelings be known on many, many things, and he probably crossed a lot of people in doing that.
He had fiery editorials that, quite frankly, miffed a lot of the readers. He railed against dueling. He couldn't stand dueling. He couldn't stand public drunkenness. He couldn't stand idleness. Now, you can imagine that early Houston would have just driven him apoplectic because he is surrounded by all the things that he dislikes.
Moore's idea of running a paper went far beyond mere reporting.
Francis Moore was very outspoken, very opinionated, and of course he used the newspaper kind of as his bully pulpit. And so he didn't get along with a lot of people because he did not, he did not object to opposing anybody.
On one occasion, he suggested that anybody who had been convicted of a felony back in the United States should not be eligible for elected office in the Republic of Texas. Well, that came a little close to home for a lot of these public officials, and some people says, now who presumes to voice this opinion? And he shot back in the editorial that it's the editor, and if you got a problem, here I am.
Even in that thin-skinned society, there's no record of him ever being challenged himself.
His constant railing against dueling protected him from its pernicious effects, because nobody could call him out because he's so on record of being against it.
Eventually, Francis Moore Jr. took his crusade for Houston to the next level, being elected mayor in 1837.
On the political side of the thing, he tended to come down on the Lamar Burnett side and was a thorn in President Sam Houston's side. Sam Houston couldn't stand him at first. But not content simply to report the news, he ran for mayor of Houston and was elected in August of 1837. He ran on a law and order cleanup Houston ticket, and certainly did. And he features prominently in the double hangings of two murderers in March of 1838.
Moore designed the city seal, still in use, and oversaw many civic improvements. And, in a way, he began the legacy of Houston's annexation policy.
A lot of people had built their cabins right on the city to avoid paying city taxes, and he just extended the city limits and said, gotcha.
Houston was the capital of the Republic of Texas, but that didn't necessarily make it popular with every member of the government. President Houston, however, liked the fledgling city.
Houston is committed to Houston City. People say it's for reasons of ego, and Houston had an ego. I'm sure he was delighted that the capital was his namesake city.
Even for a man with an ego as big as Sam Houston's, to receive a letter, His Excellency Sam Houston, Houston, Texas. You know, I live in Ashby.
True that Houston was a more appropriate site at that time for a capital because it was more centrally located to the population of Texas, which was in the east. Houston, of course, was located near the Gulf, and as a result was a transportation hub as well. So from that perspective, it's true that the city of Houston was a more appropriate site than Austin for a capital for Texas as it stood at that time.
As for the inhabitants, some, especially the local merchants who could benefit from easier transportation corridors, had warmed to the new town of Houston. But most politicians in the Texas government could not wait to decamp to a more healthful location. By then, the Republic's finances were a tangled mess, despite the first Treasury Secretary's best Machiavellian efforts.
What Henry Smith had done is he devised a way to raise taxes, and this is the property tax system that we have today. That it evolved from that meeting in 1837, as well as the tax on personal property and the horses and slaves and billiard halls and so forth. And there were a lot of taxes on saloons, of which there were plenty in the Republic of Texas. And in doing so, he thought they could raise an additional $300,000 a year. Well, in 1837 dollars, that was quite a bit. And Houston pointed out, well, we can't run the economy on $300,000 a year. And Smith said, oh no, We don't have to pay off the debt. All we have to do is kick the can off the road. So that's when they came out, and they raised about $700,000 in stock through, they call that the Consolidated Fund of Texas. And what the government did was they put all the outstanding obligations that were issued at Washington, the Brazos, that were issued at San Felipe and Houston, and military pay, etc. They didn't have a way to pay them. So they bundled those and they securitized the debt. All they had to do is make the interest payments on that. Now the interest was at 10% a year. So that had added something like $80,000 a year in interest on them, but that bought them time. And don't think of it as stock, like owning stock in ExxonMobil or Apple or a company like that. Think of it as stock as a debt instrument. And it wasn't long before they defaulted on that. And that was in about February of 1842. So the Republic of Texas was as broke as you could be. Not because of the debt, because they didn't have the revenues to service the debt, unlike the U.S. today.
The deciding factor in moving the capital was term limits. After a 2-year term, Sam Houston was barred from running again. His successor was Mirabeau Lamar.
And he thought that the capital should be in the interior of Texas. Well, he sent out scouting crews. They found a little village called Waterloo on the Colorado River.
The first settlement where Austin is now, it was a ford over the Colorado River, the farthest north before you got to what they euphemistically call the mountains. And it remained the community of Waterloo until 1839, when it was elevated to be the capital of the Republic of Texas and named Austin. That was accomplished by President Mirabeau Bonaparte Lamar, who envisioned Texas stretching from the Sabine River all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And if that were true, you needed a capital more centrally located to that territory than was the case with the capital in Houston.
It did what Lamar wanted it to. It encouraged movement in there. They picked a lovely spot, as it turns out, but it was just wilderness.
Austin was even smaller and more raw than Houston City.
The new town of Austin, proud as it was a community of only wooden buildings, 200, maybe 300 inhabitants, strung out along what is now Congress Avenue from the rise where the Capitol is down to the river.
The day the French ambassador, or called him at the time, I guess, Charge d'Affaires, presented his credentials to the Texas government, 2 Austinites were scalped right outside the city limits. I think the Frenchman may have wanted to turn and go back home at that point.
Sam Houston was still the biggest hero in Texas, and he didn't like the idea.
And on the exposed frontier, which is why Sam Houston didn't, or one reason Sam Houston did not like it, and called it the most unfortunate place on earth for a capital. But it's true, it was on the exposed frontier, open to Indian raids, indefensible from Mexican invasion or Indian raids.
When we look at the political division inside the Republic of Texas, the main strength of Houston's support is in eastern Texas. The main source of Lamar's support is in western Texas. And when the people out in places like Bastrop and Gonzales are being attacked by Comanches, or for that matter Austin, they say, we need protection. And the people in East Texas are saying, well, you idiots, if you didn't live out on the edge of Comancheria, you wouldn't need protection. And Lamar's people are saying, look, these are our citizens too. We're moving, I mean, if you look at a map, we claim all the way to Santa Fe.
Even though Sam Houston was out of the presidency, he used patriotism to appeal to Texans to stay the course.
Parties have destroyed nations, but they have never created country. Texas can maintain but one party, and that must be the Texas Party. Sam Houston.
Lamar and Houston did not get along well at all because Houston wanted to have Texas annexed to the United States, and Lamar wanted Texas to be an independent country. So they were very much opposed to each other.
Another point of controversy and tension between Lamar and Houston, thus causing the division. Lamar hated Native Americans. Sam Houston loved Native Americans. In fact, spent most of his life with the Cherokees. They named him the Raven. But he wanted peace with the Indians. Lamar wanted to exterminate them. Kiowa, Kickapoo, etc. Okay? It's during Lamar's administration that you established the Texas Rangers, right? A frontier defense primarily against the Comanches and Kiowas, what are left of those. He wanted to continue the war with Mexico. He wanted to rebuild the army. These are all policies Houston adamantly opposed.
Houston serves his term. He can't run again. And Lamar is elected. Now, what you've got here is an utterly schizophrenic public policy, because now you've got somebody in Austin, it was in Austin at that time, who tries to utterly undo everything his predecessor did, and then after Lamar serves his term, Houston is back and does the same thing.
Houston's appeal to Texans' better nature did not work. Perhaps most fundamental were the enormous differences between Presidents Houston and Lamar.
He's a poet. He fancies himself a cavalier. He's well-read. If you want to study in contrast, here is this sort of bookish academic fellow on one hand, and Lamar on the other hand. You've got Houston, who's sort of blustery and not what we would call reflective. I mean, a very talented politician, but nobody ever described Sam Houston as an intellectual.
Lamar was just as much of an egomaniac as, maybe even more so, than Houston. They not only personally disliked each other, probably because of egos, but their policies were totally different for Texas. The policies they envisioned when Texas was a republic.
Complicating things further, when Lamar's term expired, Sam Houston became president again.
After the officers of government had left, and they left all of their paper in Austin, not only the archives, the written records, the land office records, the records of the military during the Revolution, and other government records that had been created in the meantime, not only did they leave that, but they even left the blank paper. It was hard to run government if you couldn't create more records.
The president conducting business in Washington on the Brazos, and yet all the archives, all the state papers are in Austin.
The Mexican Army had made 2 forays into Texas in 1842, twice taking San Antonio. That was the excuse Sam Houston needed to use his emergency powers.
And Houston sent an armed posse up to Austin to seize the Republic's records and bring them back to Houston, which would kind of officially make Houston again the capital.
Houston issued an executive order to Captain Eli Chandler to come to Austin, gather a group of men, about 24 men, come under the guise of Indian defense, but come with wagons, move them to the land office, which is where the archives were stored, to load the archives into the wagons and to depart with them for Houston. The detachment that Houston ordered to come to Austin, only the 2 leaders, Thomas Smith and Eli Chandler, knew what the purpose of them coming to Austin was. The records are in some conflict, but it appears that the men came at night, pulled the wagons up to the land office, and began loading the records. Somewhere around dawn, Angelina Eberly, who ran a boarding house in Austin, when she got up and began doing her chores, looked out and saw the wagons at the land office, and she knew they were up to no good. Angelina Eberly then went to the center of town, roughly 6th and Congress, where Austin kept a small cannon for Indian defense. It even said the cannon was loaded, though that seems hard to believe. In any case, she wheeled the cannon around, aimed it at the land office, and discharged it. The records do show that a load of grape shot rattled off the wall of the land office, at which point the conspirators, we Austinites call them, decided they had enough records and urged the oxen out of town.
The Houston contingent made it to Round Rock, where they made camp for the night.
And when they woke up the next morning, they found themselves surrounded by a posse of approximately 80 men from Austin with that cannon, demanding their surrender. Having no way to defend themselves and having been ordered by Sam Houston not to spill blood over the archives, they surrendered.
So the wagons returned to Austin.
The conspirators were treated to a wonderful dinner and told to get the hell out of town and don't come back. The archives then were, the boxes in which the archives were transported, actually they were buried until Anson Jones, till Sam Houston was out of office, and the new president, Anson Jones, brought the government back to Austin, and at that point all of the archives were turned over to Jones.
It's an impossible situation, but one that ultimately probably ensures that it is Austin that is going to ultimately be the capital.
At least for Austinites, the Archives War is not forgotten.
Not much is known about Angelina Eberly. There is no image of her. We don't know even what she looked like, but it's clear that she was a very spunky woman. Austin does have the only piece of public art commemorating archives in one way or another in this entire country. And that statue is a heroic-sized statue of Angelina Eberly firing the cannon. It's on Congress Avenue, just north of 6th Street, the center of town, and the cannon is positioned exactly to aim at Houston.